This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. Dover is a beneficiary of multiple natural resources, including 3 rivers that make up the riparian life here in Dover: the Bellamy, the Piscataqua, and certainly the Cochecho, which runs right through the center of town. The Cochecho River is one of those rivers I think that people look at and assume what's there now, which is a nice recreational river with development around it and with the marina on it, as the way life has always been. Today, George Maglaras, owner of George's Marina, is going to walk us through how that always hasn't been the case. George, welcome.
Well, thanks, Chris, for having me.
You know, I've worked for the city about 30 years, and during that time, we see various development plans for the waterfront, which are now underway, and they all take a lead from plans that you've done over the years, visions that you and others have had, and we celebrate those visions. And it struck me recently that we can celebrate those visions all we want, but if there hadn't been a vision to clean up the river, none of this would be occurring. And I say that because for years, and it seems to me that it's post Dover's Black Day when there was a flood that really changed the elevation of the river, the material base of the river. Between then and maybe 50 years ago, the late to mid 70s, the river was the back alleyway of the community. We had a wastewater treatment plant that put its effluent into it. And I think I'm being nice in saying effluent. It really was not the asset it is today.
There's no question about that. You know, the Cochecho River, for right about after Dover's Black Day in 1896, and in the early 1900s, once the shipping industry left the waterfront, then we just basically, as Dover was growing and the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, the river just became nothing but an open trench sewer. Yep. That's basically what it was. All the domestic waste of the municipality and all industrial waste just dumped raw in the river, and that it basically, first of all, killed all the wildlife. And that's, you know, there's an old saying, Dover by this, Portsmouth by the sea, Dover by the smell. Well, we had shoe shops downtown. We had
the tanneries.
We had chrome plating plants that were dumping chromium in the river. Just everything got dumped in the river. And when you say everything, you know, people look at you and they say, well, what do you mean by everything? And I mean everything.
People forget that the Clean Water Act is not all that old.
Oh, that's right. In 72, the Clean Water Act came about. So what happened was my grandfather bought a house on Cochecho Street in 1920 and he came from Greece. We had a farm. There was a small farmhouse there, and everybody grew vegetables in their backyard. But the river, the waterfront, was basically a bunch of dilapidated buildings, burnt out buildings. There wasn't hardly anything there. And the pollution started to ramp up, especially during World War II. So my dad and his brothers and sisters all grew up on Cochecho Street. My father had 3 older brothers. They all went into the war effort. And when they came back in 45, the river was really bad. I mean, the amounts of industrial, as we went through this, big world war. Mm-hmm. So the production of materials to fight the war was happening. All the byproducts from that all went raw in the river, along with all the domestic sewage from all the whole entire community, medical waste from the hospital, blood from the funeral parlors. I mean, people don't have,
you name it, and it was that.
You name it, it was getting flushed into the river. So my dad, when he came back from the war in 1945, New Hampshire had first formed the Water Supply and Pollution Control Commission in 1946. So he wrote a letter to them deploring the amount of industrial and domestic waste that was being dumped in the Cochecho River, and released. My dad was a kind of an environmentalist far before it became fashionable to be one. He didn't. He thought the river had a future. He always told me he thought he was born 100 years too late because he'd rather be at sea on a ship, on a wooden ship. Mm-hmm. And he thought he was born 100 years too late. In any event, he always thought that the river could be cleaned back up and become a vibrant resource for the city again. Now, that was an opinion that there was little support for. And so he kept writing letters and coming to City Hall and, demonstrating to the people how we were basically killing our own environment. There was no wildlife.
Right.
No fish.
No sea life, yeah.
No sea life. Every year the alewives would start a run in April like they do now, but they would come up the river and they would die by the thousands. Tens of thousands of fish would die. And then their bodies would lay on the flats. So the tide would come in and out. And you combine that with all the industrial surge and the domestic surge, and you combine it all, and it would stink like you read about. And the tannery hides, all the tannery hides. Matter of fact, up on Orchard Street where the United Tanners were, they had a pile of clippings from the hides when they were processing the hides. All the processing chemicals all dumped raw in the river. And there was a laundromat back there called American Cleaners, and they did laundry for a lot of people in town. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a bad business, but all the detergents all dumped raw in the river. When it would go over the dam, it would actually foam up. It would suds up. So the suds would run from the dam down around the waterfront where it is today, where the marina is today, and where the new development is. And the river would be, 6, 7 feet, 8 feet thick in soap suds when I was a kid. And they were all different colors. There would be blue, purples, and greens. And there's a photograph. I rode out into the middle of it once when I was a little boy in a skiff, and my dad took a picture of me with my head, just my head, sticking out of the soap suds. Okay? That was coming from American Cleaners. So in any event, my dad kept writing these letters, and my Uncle John eventually got elected on the city council in the mid-1950s. And they kept calling for the cleaning up of the river. And my dad always used to say that if one woman could take prayer out of schools, that he could clean up a 3.5-mile stretch of river. That's what he always would say. I ought to be able to do that if one woman could take prayer out of school. So in 1960, my Uncle John doesn't get a lot of credit for the work he did, but he served on the city council for 22 years, longer than anybody in the history of the city of Dover. But my Uncle John was very instrumental in getting, first of all, number one, getting the city dump moved, because the dump was down at where Maglaras Park is today. The city dump was there. And they had the ability to draw down on some limited federal money at the time to build a wastewater treatment plant. Now, we had no wastewater treatment plant prior to 1960. So everything went in the water. And actually from 1960 until 1976, only the south side of the city was tied into the treatment plant. The north side still dumped raw. When I graduated from high school, I graduated in 75. When I graduated from high school, the north end of the city was still dumping raw sewage in the river. Give you some ideas. So anyway, the political argument became, and how we ended up getting the first wastewater treatment plant was that my dad and my uncles were all fighting, and with help of others, saying that we should clean this river up. And okay, where's the treatment plant going to go? Mm-hmm. And nobody wanted a treatment plant. Nobody wanted a treatment plant in their backyards. And you can understand why.
Sure. So
the argument went on. They argued for a couple of years about where the treatment plant was going to go. And it really should have been put at Dover Point. But people at Dover Point didn't want it. Of course, nobody wanted it. So then they basically said to my Uncle John, the only people that want the river cleaned up is the Maglaras family. So if you people want the river cleaned up so much, you're going to have to put the treatment plant in your backyard because nobody else wants it. So then my Uncle John said, okay, fine. Well, if you're going to put the treatment plant in our backyard, you're going to move the city dump out of there because the city dump's there now.
Yep.
So that's how we ended up with Toland Road landfill. They had bought Harry Toland's farm. That was a deal that was cut, political deal that was cut. And so we got the treatment plant in our backyard, and it was constructed in 1960. Toland Road became our new town dump. They used to have an incinerator over at Maglaras Park, and they used to incinerate the trash over there as well. And it just sat there, basically. But when that occurred, when we first built the first treatment plant, remember only half the city was tied into it. And it wasn't very good. It didn't function very well. It was like a motorcycle. It's only good when it's nice out. It doesn't function very well when it rains or it snows. We had so much infiltration that back then we had all the sewers and all the storm drains were tied together. So when it would rain, the treatment plant would flood.
It would just overflow.
It would just overflow. And they had to put the pipe going to down River Street, they put a baffle plate in it. And the pipe that was entering the treatment plant, they put a baffle plate in it. And as the water rose, anything that went over the top of that baffle plate just discharged raw in the river. And of course, that would be the things that float.
Right.
So it gives you some idea of what was being discharged in the river, okay? And so we went through decades-long program of separating the sewer systems from the storm drain systems in the city. So during that time in the 1960s, we started that process. And my Uncle John was chairman of the committee that made the decisions. They would appropriate so much money every year. Mm-hmm. And then he was the chairman of the committee that made a decision as to what streets and what neighborhoods would be separated, where the storm drains would be separated from the sewer systems. And so Dover was tore up for a very, very long time.
That was my guess, was there must have been constant road repair.
Right, constant. It was constant. Some people were required to tie into the sewer when they were tied into a storm drain. They ran in their backyard. Okay, there was just sewers running all over the place. Like on our property on Cochecho Street, we had 6 open trench sewers that ran across our property. We hooked pipes up to them and just got them to the river and filled over the trenches. I remember doing that.
And you weren't alone. I mean, that was a pretty common trend.
Yeah, it was a common thing.
Got to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, it's got to get to the river somehow. So for about a little over 20 years, more than 20 years, my Uncle John was chairman of the pollution committee of the city. And then eventually we worked to tie the north end of the city into the treatment plant. However, because of that decision to put the treatment plant where it was, the old site which we're developing today. Right. In order to do that, you have to have a lot of pump stations. If they'd put the plant initially at Dover Point, you could have gravity fed most of the entire city to Dover Point. So we ended up in the late 1980s when I was chairman of the planning board, I was urging the construction of a new wastewater treatment plant. And it should have been put at Dover Point. And the council argued about it then. And eventually the council says, yeah, it can't stay where it is. Because the regs, all the increased regulations as a result of the Clean Water Act of 1972 required the city of Dover to do a bunch of stuff.
The consent decree helped with that decision, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Yep, that's for sure. So, but all those efforts by a lot of folks, I mean, initially it was my dad and then my uncle, but other folks that, like Hugh Tuttle as an example, he owned a farm, the oldest farm. He was an environmentalist, so he got it. There was a few other people in town. Stuart Chains is another one. Lou Stockland. There was a bunch of folks that understood it and got it, but they weren't too excited about having to pay the bill to do all this separation that took place. But the sad part about it all is that most of the people that lived in that neighborhood down there all died of very, very young, and they all had all these very, very bad diseases that came from, some would say it came from the exposure to the river.
Yep.
Not just in my family, but other families as well. Brain tumors, other types of really weird cancers like cysts on people's spines. And
okay.
And they all got it very, very young in it. So Cornell University did a study in the 1960s of all the rivers in New England, the level of pollution that was in it, in the rivers at the time. Now, we weren't the only ones that were doing that.
Sure.
That was the way it was.
And we're at the end of the Cochecho, so there's Rochester, another.
Right, you got Rochester, Farmington North that were dumping sewage in. The county farm, the county operations, we had a lagoon system up there where the nursing home and jail all went to the domestic sewage from those operations would just go into these big lagoons. And we would run air compressors and aerate the lagoons to get bacteria build up and try to eat some of the domestic sewage up. And then we would just inject it with chlorine and dump it in the river. And that's basically what the first plan
Sure.
did.
And that was pretty common technology.
It was. I mean, that's all you do is take the solids out, inject it with chlorine, and that was that. So all those industries that we had downtown cost us a lot of money. I mean, they were job creators, but they destroyed a lot of the infrastructure, the sewer lines, the storm drain lines.
Yep.
We had chrome plating plants that were rotting. I mean, Franklin chrome plating. I mean, Mr. Franklin was a great guy.
However,
However, his process of his operation rotted out all the main sewers in the entire downtown. We had to go in and replace them all. And anywhere where we had, Davison Rubber, the place, they had an operation down at Sawyer Mills. They were dumping raw stuff in the Bellamy River. It was just the nature of how we did business. But Cornell had determined that the Cochecho River was one of the top 10 most polluted rivers in the United States in the early 1960s. That's how bad it was.
that's pretty bad.
That's pretty bad. Okay. Yeah.
So a lot of lists you want to be in the top 10 of.
No, that's not one of them, right? So these efforts were made over decades by people. Everyone builds off the actions and the generations that come prior to you. And if it wasn't for those efforts back then, none of this that we have going on here would have happened.
So when did you or your dad open the marina?
So my dad in 1960 bought 500 feet of property on Cochecho,
On a cesspool.
on a sewer, and he decided he wanted to open up a boatyard. Now, in the beginning, it's not like it is today. It was just a place for his friends to tie up some boats initially, and he called it George's Marina, and up until from 1960 to 1969, he built enough docks to hold about 30 boats, small boats. I can remember when my Uncle John was mayor in 1970, he bought a brand new boat. It was the biggest boat between Dover and Portsmouth. The biggest boat. It was 21 feet long. Okay? All boats back then were wood. Very little fiberglass. Nobody around here could afford a fiberglass boat. That would be like a huge luxury. So that's when he started the marina. It was a hobby for him. He didn't make a living at it. So in 73, my father got very, very sick in 1971. So by 73, he asked me to work on boats. He says, you need to go work on boats. And it's kind of a cute story. We had Bud McIntosh, who was one of the top 10 wooden boat builders in the whole world.
Dover Point.
Down in Dover Point. And Bud, my father says, you're going down, I'm making arrangements for Bud for you to go down and learn how to build boats. I says, all right. So I get on a bus. So my father drops me off. It's in the middle of winter. Drops me off down there. And Bud had this great barn on Dover Point, this woodworking shop where he built boats. We built a number of boats in that barn. My father dropped me off and says, Bud's going to teach you how to build wooden boats. So I said, okay. So I had a toolbox with me, and I went and walked in with the toolbox, and my father left, and Bud had a wood stove going in. It was dead of winter. It was cold. And he said to me, he opened up the toolbox. He's looking at the toolbox. It's got a hammer in there and a square and all these things, a regular carpenter's box.
Right.
And he went over to the window, and he opened up the window, and he threw the toolbox out into the snowbank, and he says, you don't need any of those when you build boats. He goes, you know what an adze is? And I went, no. He goes, you and I got to walk up on the orchard up there on the hill, he goes, and get some knees out of apple trees. So an adze is an axe that goes the other way. So instead of hitting an axe, you would hit an axe with a forward motion, right? And it would split wood. The head of an adze is in the opposite direction.
Oh.
So when you hit with it, you're actually scoring, okay? And what you would do is you'd go up and take the knees out of apple trees, and they'd grow back. It wouldn't kill the tree. You'd take the knees out in the winter, and the natural curve of the knee of the tree is what you would use to build the ribs in boats. They had a natural curve to it. So then you'd have what's known as a steam box. And I know I'm kind of getting off subject here, but in the steam box, you'd heat water, and you'd pump it through this wooden box, and you'd lay the lumber in there, and you'd steam it. and then you could take the lumber out and fit it.
Right. You could
So whatever shape it, you shape it however you want. And anyway, Bub was a fine gentleman. It was a fine family, and I stayed there for about a week. And all I had was a pair of sneakers. Didn't have any money, and I had a pair of sneakers. My feet were froze. I was up in the snowbanks, cutting the knees of apple trees out with Bud McIntosh. Anyway, I ended up getting another job, and I told my dad, I said, I don't want to build wooden boats. There's no money in it, and I'm freezing to death, and I can't do this. And he's going, well, no, he goes, you really got to have more training than that. You've got to get, the boats are becoming fiberglass. The power plants are changing. You got to go to them. So I ended up going to a marine technical school in New Jersey in the mid 1970s. And I said, Dad, I don't want to work on boats. I want to be in the government. That's where all the decisions are made. I don't want to.
You wanted to be your Uncle John.
Yeah, I wanted to follow my Uncle John's footsteps. And he said, well, he goes, that's all well and good, he says, but when you're in politics, he says that when you start off, half the people hate you before you even get started. When you first elected, half the people hate you automatically. You better recognize that. And you're going to have a thick skin. And he says, just go learn how to work on boats, and just do it for a couple of years till I can afford to hire a mechanic.
50 years later, you're still
50 years later, I'm still there. Yeah. So I'd tell you another story about it. Because when I was a kid, I played on the river and as a matter of fact, when you played on a river when you were a kid in Dover, you had to learn how to swim. And the first thing the older kids did was they throw you in the river, and you either swam or you weren't going to do too well.
Right.
Anyway, there was one day talking about pollution. Sunday morning, we had a little tiny boat, like a 10-foot skiff with a 3-horse Buccaneer outboard, and they haven't made Buccaneer outboards in 70 years, but it was an old 3-horse Buccaneer outboard, and we were going to go for a boat ride. So I started the Buccaneer outboard up, my dad get in the boat, and we left the dock, and the churning of that 3-horse outboard just was enough to start a chemical reaction in the river. And the entire river started to boil like a pot of water you see on a stove.
Yeah.
These giant balls of gas were bubbling up out of the riverbed. It was, I was just a kid, but it was scary because this thing it's like you're in a pot of boiling water, and you couldn't breathe because the chemicals were so tremendous. So, he yelled at me, get that boat back to the dock. We got to get out of here, right? So we're trying to hold our breaths, and the river was boiling. I mean, the entire river was boiling. And in August, July and August, about this time of year, the pollution would be so bad. When the tide would go out, the pollution would bake on the mud flats. It would bake.
Wow.
And then when the tide came in, it would lift up probably 2.5, 3 inches of the mud flat itself. And it would cover the entire river when the tide came in. You could drive a boat through it. But if you went along like 20 miles an hour and you hit one of those cakes, we used to call it cake, you hit the cake, the boat would stop. And so, the pollution was unreal. And God bless the Foster family. They used to dump all their printer's ink into the river. One time, I was in the 4th grade, and the alewives were dying, of course. They come up river and they would die. They had died from a lack of oxygen. The pollution took all the oxygen out of the water. And then the chromium and the heavy metals would get caught in their gills and they would suffocate. Found this out many years later, how it worked.
Okay.
Working with the University of New Hampshire. They'd put fish traps in. But anyway, I was down there in the 4th grade now, and my father told me to get down on the mud flats and start clearing the fish off because the flies, the stink was really bad. So I did that, and he gave me these farmers would come down and give us these big grain tubs that you see on a farm, galvanized tubs. And I would slide them down over the bank and I would fill the tubs full of Elwise. And the farmers would come and pick up the tubs of Elwise to fertilize the farms. And then in the fall, when they had vegetables, they'd come down and give us, corn and tomatoes and whatever they were growing, cucumbers and stuff. But I was down there, and there was an old piece of granite curbing that had come off the dam during the flood of 1896. And it was a piece of granite, and it was laying on its edge, and I had to walk across it. It was like 6 foot long. And I was walking along the edge, and I was there with a couple of friends of mine I was growing up with. We were collecting the fish, and I slipped, and I fell in under the mud flat.
Yep.
So my buddy, a kid named Jerry Baker, lived on Cross Street. He came over to help me pull me out of the mud flat. When he did, I was stuck in it from suction, and he fell on top of me.
Oh, jeez.
And I got pushed down into the pollution. Well, finally crawled out of it, and I went home, and I take my clothes off outside, and my mother made me take a shower outside, but my skin was all red and purple. I had from the dyes that were in the mud flats. And so it looked like I had gotten a massive big ass tattoo. but it was on my face, it was down my body, and it took at least 3 months. We couldn't get it off. And I was in the 4th grade when that happened. So kids were picking on me at school and stuff.
I bet.
You know. But I mean that's how it was. It was we were kind of playing in the sewer,
So I had hoped to learn about the river, the efforts that you and your family and others have done to clean the pollution. I appreciate you going through all that. It makes me think we should have you back to talk about some of the other uses along the river, the gasification plant,
right? Yeah,
Eversource, PSNH's activities. Would you be willing to come back and talk to the listener?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've done a number of historical tours on the river about the types of industry that were there and the good and bad about them. Yeah, I'd love to come back and do that. It would be fun.
All right, let's do that.
Okay.
Thanks for coming in.
Okay. Thank you. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Download's email newsletter every week or other newsletters that we have by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.